You are listening to That Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding. I don't talk in real life about having hoarding disorder, so I talk about it on this podcast instead. And because I'm anonymous, I can talk really, really honestly. Subscribe to the podcast and find my social media links, episode transcripts, and every link that I mention at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. Finally, I am not a doctor. I'm just a hoarder doing her best. So do seek professional support if and when you need it. So I am here with Dr. Jennifer Krafft, who is the director of the Mindfulness and Acceptance Processes Lab and an assistant professor at Mississippi State University. She has a PhD in psychology, and her research focuses on improving the treatment of hoarding disorder, OCD, and anxiety, using mindfulness and acceptance processes in particular, including self-help interventions for when cost, availability, location, and stigma prevent people from accessing outside help. And she is also an editor of the book Advances in Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. So how did you get into the area of looking at hoarding disorder?
Some of it came from sort of personal experience of, I guess, seeing the variability in my life of how people related to their belongings. Like I have some folks that I know pretty well who are, I would say, at least sort of pack rats, who feel pretty attached to things. And I've always, I suppose, been a little bit further on the other end of a little bit sort of inclined to minimalism. And I think at first really just wanted to understand what is it that explains that variability in us. Why is it that for some people it would be such a bigger deal to let go of things? And so it came out, I guess, from initial curiosity, and then sort of the more that I got into psychology and was exposed to different areas of psychology and clinical psychology, thinking about treatment. That's when I really saw just what a huge kind of gap there is between how common hoarding problems are and the treatments that are available for them. It's the best way to put it. We're maybe 20, 30 years behind, it feels like, in the treatment of hoarding compared to disorders that are equally common. We know it's really pretty common, I'm sure you said this before, but 2.5% of the population is kind of our good estimate. And even more people, and that's a hoarding disorder, so there's even more people who may not need to check all those boxes, but are affected by clutter in some way. And yet our treatments that are available are so limited. Knowledge among providers is so limited, the number of providers that give good treatment, the number of providers that are really adequately trained in understanding hoarding disorder just feels so limited to the scope of the problem. So I think that's really kept me interested, that sense of it just is an area where there's a lot of need.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are talking today about stigma, which you have looked at a lot in your work, and I have talked about a lot on this podcast. Why do you think hoarding is such a stigmatized condition? And why are some mental health conditions more stigmatized than others?
Such an interesting question. Yeah, I think most people have a gut sense that hoarding is quite stigmatized, but I don't know if I've really been asked why before. I think some of it does have to do with knowledge. So lacking knowledge can certainly be a piece of stigma. There are other conditions that there may also be some stigma related to, other diagnoses like schizophrenia. But I think there is a little bit more public awareness that that something like that is a disorder, it's a psychological disorder, that it's maybe caused by all sorts of different factors, that it's not necessarily the fault of the person with the disorder. And there probably is there is certainly less knowledge about hoarding. We do know less about what causes it. So I think lack of knowledge is probably some piece of it. One thing that we also know for sure is that some of the TV programs that depicted hoarding and introduced hoarding into sort of common knowledge probably did also exacerbate stigma. I'm curious, I know that there was a big kind of phenomenon in the US. Was it equally so in the UK?
Not as big, and a few years later, but still it happened. I read there's a paper about the impact of hoarding depictions in reality TV on public perception. And it did show that they showed students various different shows. And after watching one of the hoarding specific ones in particular, it did increase the stigma they felt towards people who hoard. Whereas other programs about, I think one was about cleaning in a similar way, but didn't specifically talk about hoarding. And one was about moving house. And they had less of an effect on how people viewed people who hoard. I hate those shows. I do. It's how I first learnt that this was a thing, but there have to be better ways of getting that information out.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. There is some sense in which they probably, raised awareness of hoarding being a condition, but man, did they come with a lot of downsides. That's interesting to know about the difference. I can't tell you how often, like if I tell people that I work in hoarding, people say like, oh, I have a lot of stuff, but like not like those TV shows, like the desire to distance, even, among people with relatively serious is so strong. I feel like I see the effect of it. Like I see it sort of inhibiting people's comfort in talking about this issue.
Yeah. And if you want to make a TV program entertaining, that isn't always conducive to ethical treatment of a person on it, I think.
Yeah, I think one thing that comes to mind for me too, which maybe ties back to that question of like, why is hoarding so stigmatized? I do think those shows really don't give you a great sense of what's going on in the mind of the person with the hoarding problem. Like, I think they often sort of leave that or it feels like that's often a bit of a blank. You sort of end with no better idea than you started with. Like, why does this person want to keep?
Yeah, we've seen them melt down several times over a broken teapot, but not really why.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that's really, really missing is like just a broader sense or a broader understanding of like what is the thought process going on for somebody with hoarding? Why does it feel so different to them? Yeah.
I also wonder whether there's something about it being an extreme of normal. So people think, well, if I can keep my house clean, or I had a messy house and I tidied up, why? I don't know. I feel like it's something about if I can keep my house under control, these people must be lazy, dirty, all those things that we hear.
And that's so unfortunate because I do think most of us have some area of our lives that feels a bit out of control, right? Most of us have something that we're a little bit compulsive about, that we feel like we're not quite in control of our eating or our drinking. And then we may have other areas that are like, it's, very easy for me to have one drink and stop. And that wouldn't be the case for other people. So it would be nice if people could sort of take that understanding of the areas that they do have trouble with, where it is hard for them to control their behavior, whatever that might be, and feel a sense of connection. So yeah, maybe that's an area of promise. If people could sort of help people draw some of those dots together.
And sometimes pointing that out can help. I think people just haven't made that link. But when they think, oh yeah, I don't know, I'm always late to work, or I have this particular problem that I can't seem to get over. And maybe it's not that different. But you did a really interesting study on whether people who use self-help find that it reduces their sense of stigmatization. Can you talk a bit about that and what you found?
Yeah, so that one we looked at, people hadn't necessarily been, so it's a kind of a general student sample as we sometimes use. And people hadn't necessarily been receiving any self-help or treatment, but we asked them about sort of their intentions. If they were struggling with some kind of mental health problem, where would they be likely to seek help from? And what we found was we were kind of like testing this intuition that a lot of folks have, that like self-help might overcome barriers to stigma, but there's not actually a ton of research on like how much does it do that. So what we found was there was a substantial proportion of people who weren't interested in getting help from a mental health professional, but said they would use self-help. So it did seem to be meeting the needs, not like the majority of folks, but a substantial group of folks were interested in self-help. And we also found that like kind of mental health stigma was related to whether people were willing to seek professional help. So if people endorsed more mental health stigma, they were less interested in talking with a professional, but it was kind of unrelated to their willingness to use self-help. So many people had some willingness to use self-help, even if they had some degree of stigma. So it was showing some of that, showing some initial promise that, maybe self-help really can bridge some of those gaps. And I think that kind of probably fits with a lot of people's lived experience too. There are people who might have some clutter at home who might not be comfortable bringing it up with the doctor or going to see somebody for it, but will pick up a self-help book or like try out an app or something like that.
Or listen to a podcast. What are the effects of stigma on people who hoard?
So the effects of stigma includes, a really broad variety of things. I mean, one way we divide up stigma sometimes is what we might call public stigma. So the sense of like stigma from other people, the feeling of being judged by other people, a sense that other people have negative attitudes towards hoarding, and then acts of like discrimination as well, acts of maltreatment, unfair treatment, which are certainly an issue. And then there's more of the kind of self-stigma, internalized stigma side, where if you've got a condition that is stigmatized, that is misunderstood, you may internalize kind of negative beliefs. I'm lazy, there's something wrong with me, negative attitudes towards yourself emotionally, which go along with negative emotions, right? Shame, embarrassment, frustration. And that can tie into your behavior, right? That can lead to more hiding. So those are, I think, some of the major ways that we see things play out are probably just stigma as sort of an inhibitor. Stigma is something that causes people to keep hoarding secret, not bring it up to people, not seek help, especially from professionals, not invite people over, right? So there are places where we don't have as much research as we would like on this, and this is probably one of those, but my sense is that stigma plays into all of these different areas of life that we know are severely impacted at times by hoarding. So we know it's causing problems in people's social lives and their relationships. We know that loneliness tends to be a problem that a lot of folks with hoarding struggle with. And I expect that stigma plays a role in exacerbating some of those things, making it harder to make connection.
Does self-stigma always start from public stigma? Or can we do that to ourselves without it coming from outside?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I genuinely I think often those kind of internalized beliefs, many of us hold some degree of sort of negative attitudes towards ourselves, whether that fits neatly within stigma or not. And I think often those come from somewhere, like even things that are really on interactions that sort of tell you something negative about yourself that then you just can't quite get out of your head after that. So I think they often, my sense is they typically come through sort of interaction with the world and other people, but our minds are very active and our minds can sort of draw connections or make interpretations that wouldn't necessarily come directly from other people. So there probably is some role of like, what's the lens that you're looking through? Are you looking through rose-colored glasses or whatever the inverse of that is?
Do we know why some people feel very kind of paralyzed and ashamed by stigma and some people seem to just be able to shrug it off?
I don't think we know exactly, but I would say like a lens that I think about this through is acceptance and commitment therapy, which I know you've talked about on several podcasts previously. And this core process at the center of acceptance and commitment therapy, the core sort of set of skills and ways of thinking and ways of behaving that we think are helpful with a broad range of psychological problems. Stigma, we call like psychological flexibility. So that includes lots of different kind of components, and they may look different for different people. but a sense of your personal values, a sense of what is like really, really meaningful to you, the things that make life worth living, the things that make hard things worth doing, fit in with your values. Kind of mindfulness in the present moment, the ability to see your thoughts as thoughts, the ability to connect with a sense of yourself as an observer of your experience, rather than being the same as your thoughts, rather than being totally defined by your thoughts and beliefs and identities. All of those kinds of processes are things that I think can help people navigate stigma effectively. Navigate stigma, I guess, without it completely taking over and burdening you to the extent that you're paralyzed and can't act in line with what's important to you. So yeah, I think there is variability, and we have some research on this from other areas of stigma, that this process is related to all sorts of different aspects of stigma, including internalized self-stigma and stigma towards other people. So I think it is, on the one hand, like once you have some sort of stigmatizing negative belief in your head about yourself, about others, a stereotype, I don't know of any way to make that like go away completely. We're really good at learning things. We're really bad at unlearning things. It's unfortunate sometimes. But I do think that those processes of kind of learning to recognize, okay, that's a thought that I'm having right now, or to recognize something like an emotion of shame and get a little bit used to saying like, okay, shame gets to come along for the ride. I'm going to feel ashamed and I'm going to ask for help or something like that. I do think that those are skills that we can develop that can help people to not be so burdened by stigma.
Yeah.
I also don't want to put all the onus on the person with stigma to solve those problems, because that stigma is
completely, yeah,
real, and it shouldn't all be on you to navigate it perfectly. It should also be on other people to reevaluate their stigma.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like you have to live in your own brain.
Yeah.
And so having some degree of kind of management of that helps, but that's not letting everybody off the hook.
Yes.
For making you feel bad if they do.
Yeah.
If somebody is stigmatized by society on multiple fronts, so perhaps they hoard and are a person of color subject to racism, or they hoard and they are trans and subject to transphobia, does this affect how stigma might affect them?
Makes sense to me. It certainly seems likely to me. That's very much an area where I don't think we know nearly enough. When I said like hoarding is like a couple decades behind, I think that's one place where we really see we have very little research on sort of culture and identity and hoarding, and compared to other conditions, much less. But I would expect so. And some of those are sort of double discrimination in multiple forms that I expect could be really challenging to navigate. Like if somebody has sort of understandable worries about talking about hoarding, and they're also like a transgender person who might worry about experiencing discrimination or might have experiences of discrimination in healthcare settings before, I do think that could be particularly challenging.
It feels like if somebody's kind of already kicked one line of their defenses down, it's just easier to get closer to the really harmful bit. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that does make sense. I wouldn't want to flatten it either. Like I think in some ways, some of those identities can also be a source of resilience, right? Yeah. Somebody who is transgender and has experiences effectively advocating for themselves, even in challenging situations, they might have a set of skills that really help them.
So true. Yeah. Yeah.
But certainly, like, it's a very under-resourced area. Providers don't know nearly enough about just hoarding in general, let alone, hoarding in diverse populations. So it's something I would like to see a lot more work on.
Yeah, I'm thinking about my own life, and I went through being very stigmatized for being gay and taking that on board and going, yes, this is terrible. I am terrible. This is the worst. And then coming out with a bang and rejecting all of that and feeling strong against those onslaughts because I had this kind of core shift in myself. And then still not being able to talk about hoarding in real life because, I feel that stigma and shame very, very strongly.
Yeah, it's upsetting that that's like so, that barrier is so hard to cross. And I think it is for many, many people to talk openly about these issues, which is, which is really, really unfortunate.
It is. I think the fact that I get many more private messages from listeners than public replies on social media because they don't want anybody to see shows me that it's not just me who really has that fear of people finding out.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And we do know that sort of fear of being judged, that's one of the big barriers that gets in the way for folks. And that's an understandable concern. That's an understandable concern.
It is. I've got a favour to ask that could make a big difference. If you've been enjoying the podcast and want to support it, here are some ways you could do it. Consider making a donation. Every £1 helps me keep the podcast running. Alternatively, show some love by leaving a review. Your words really mean a lot to me and they help others to discover the podcast. And do spread the word. Share the episodes with anyone who might benefit from listening. Whether it's a donation, a review, or just sharing, your support keeps me going. Find out more at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support. In episode 129, I talked with Dr. Jan Eppingstall, who is one of those other names that is on a lot of the studies, who is a regular guest. And we talked about psychological flexibility. You did a study on psychological inflexibility and stigma and how acceptance and commitment therapy could help with that. Could you explain, first of all, the psychological inflexibility and stigma link, and then also what you found?
Yeah. So psychological inflexibility is kind of that inverse of psychological flexibility, like I mentioned. So when we are psychologically inflexible, we are more disconnected from our values. We're disconnected from sources of meaning other than sort of wanting to avoid discomfort or wanting to sort of follow the rules that our head comes, that come up in our mind. We tend to take our thoughts very, very seriously. So if I'm being psychologically inflexible and I have the thought, I can't tell anybody about this, I'm definitely not going to talk to anybody. It's definitely going to control me. Or if I have the thought of, I'm never going to make progress on this, I might stop trying to declutter. Like those thoughts are sort of responded to pretty automatically. It also involves a lot of trying to avoid unwanted emotions and also cling to positive emotions, which we do see a fair bit of when it comes to hoarding. So it's basically a pattern of behavior in which those sort of like rigid reactions to our thoughts and emotions control what we're doing to a really large degree. And in the context of stigma, sort of made sense hypothetically, and this has been demonstrated across lots of studies, that people who have that, people who are doing more of that sort of buying into negative beliefs, buying into the thoughts that they have, they are more likely to kind of engage in stigma in some way. So they're more likely to sort of believe a negative stereotype that pops into their head, or feel like, oh, if I have this negative evaluation about a group of people, it must be real and true. And there are lots of studies that back that up at this point, that there is this connection between psychological inflexibility and stigma towards other people, including like negative racial attitudes, but also mental health stigma generally. We've seen it with lots of kind of different areas of psychological disorder, and also with self-stigma as well. And we've also found that can be treated so that we can reduce people's stigma through acceptance and commitment therapy by engaging people in a process of developing more psychological flexibility, more openness, more mindfulness.
In one of my early episodes with Jan, we talked about perfectionism. Yeah. And I am very much a perfectionist, and it wasn't something I was proud of, but it felt fine. But the minute she said that it was a form of rigidity, I was suddenly like, that's not who I want to be. I don't want to be a psychologically rigid person. And so have been really consciously since then, when I spot that in myself, just kind of going, oh, that's that thing. Is this something I want to dig my heels in on? Or is this something I can actually relax on a bit? Because often it's unnecessary heel digging.
Yeah, that's really cool to hear. And there is so much overlap between perfectionism and hoarding, and also, perfectionism is a pretty broad thing that relates, a lot of people experience and relates to all sorts of different things. But yeah, I think being able to even just sort of notice it in the moment, like, oh, that's a really rigid thought. Where did that expectation come from? Why do I think I'm supposed to be caught up on my emails 100% of the time? Or why do I feel like I have to do things in just the right way? Like, why do I feel like it's a huge problem if I'm sort of doing one thing in a, half decent way? I think being able to notice that and sort of check in, just like know, like catch that sense of tightening up and see if there's even a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit of something you can do differently. That can make a big difference. The context does matter too. Like our research on perfectionism kind of says having high standards for yourself isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's when that comes with the idea that, like, if I don't meet those standards, I'm a bad person and I am less worthy.
Definitely. And also, I'm happy to have high standards at work, for instance. I think that's something I take pride in. But that doesn't mean that if I do something really unimportant in a less than brilliant way, I have to, berate myself about it. It's that kind of, maybe some proportionality in there as well.
And that sort of flexibility over time and across different situations. Like I could, for myself, I could kind of like keep up with being a perfectionist. And then I like had a small child and was like, oh, I literally can't anymore. I've hit a wall. And, really try to stick with that perfectionism in those moments, like whatever it is, whatever's going on, a loss, a depressive episode, whatever it might be. I think that's when that's a spot where you can get really entangled. And if you can find some flexibility, it makes a big difference.
Definitely. It seems to me that stigma associated with hoarding can make hoarding worse. It's a vicious cycle situation. If we can't ask for help because we're afraid we'll be judged, we may get worse because we can't access help.
Yeah.
And when we're shamed because of the problem, we feel like we're terrible people. And that doesn't help you improve anything about your mental health. Is that a pattern that you see?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think I don't know if we have research on it per se, but I think that is absolutely the case. I think we do seem to see that, like, the more you kind of push people with hoarding, the more you tend to see sort of defensiveness build up, which makes sense, right? If you're being criticized, if you're feeling criticized, you're going to have that pull towards defending and digging in and sort of focusing on, here are all the reasons why I need to keep these things or can't let these things go or things like that. There was a really interesting study. It's by Randy Frost was the lead author. I want to say it's like 2015, but I'm making that up. But there was a really interesting study where people compared like the CBT sort of thought challenging, like, identifying your thoughts and working to challenge them versus just having people list out their thoughts in the moment. And the researchers were kind of CBT affiliated. They were expecting like, this is a rigorous study, and we're going to be, likely be able to demonstrate that thought restructuring makes a difference in the moment. And what they found was very little support for that. Basically, the thought listing, I can't remember if it was worked just as well or maybe even worked a little bit better to just have people list their thoughts out loud with no challenging, no critique, no questioning them. Folks with that did as well or better. I'm forgetting which. But that study has always stuck with me. I think especially because when you find that sort of like a study that found the opposite thing of what the research team was expecting, it's always really interesting to me. And I also, in some ways, trust those findings a little bit more because as a researcher, you do have some biases sometimes in kind of what you're looking for and expecting, and you go in looking for that to some degree, even if you're doing good, rigorous science. But that has always stood out to me, that like just the difference between sort of putting people on the spot and asking them, to criticize or asking them to critique their thoughts and reconsider their thoughts may be less helpful than in a completely no pressure way, just saying like, hey, just notice your thoughts as you're doing this. Just say your thoughts out loud as you are thinking about your belongings. And some of the research I'm doing now is looking at motivation, and I'm hoping to capture some of those aspects of like, can we bring out more sort of intrinsic motivation? Can we bring out more of people's values-based motivation? And can we do that like if we are really asking people to focus on their own desire, their own, like what would be meaningful to them about decluttering, does that make motivation more stable?
It also makes me think of sometimes just saying your thought out loud really highlights how absurd it is. And when it's been just in your head, it feels quite rational. And then you say it out loud, and you go, that doesn't even make sense. And yet I've been living by that for 5 years.
Yeah, it's sort of, it really can be powerful when you say out loud, like that thought of, I am responsible, or
I've got to keep this envelope, because if I don't keep this envelope, I may find myself in a situation where the 800 envelopes upstairs aren't available and I don't have an envelope in an emergency envelope situation. And then you go, what am I talking about? That envelope can go.
Yes. Yeah, it's surprisingly powerful. And something about that being low pressure, low coercion. I think something about that really matters.
Yeah. And being able to laugh at yourself a little bit, not ridicule yourself, not any of those things, but just say it out loud and go, yeah, that is nonsense.
Yeah.
Just in quite a low-key, light-hearted way, I think can be really helpful.
Yeah. I think some of the best sort of like, we call it like cognitive diffusion, that process of like stepping back from your thoughts. And I think some of the most powerful ways are just like having a little bit of that sense of like, there you go again, mind. That's a good one. You almost got me this time. Like, great story. Like having some of that, like not in a dismissing way, hopefully, but just in a way of like having a little sense of humor, I think is really powerful.
Yeah. So this is one of those big questions that I throw at guests as if they're going to have an answer, but let's try. Is the solution to stigma one of changing society, or is it about changing how we react to stigma from others?
I think it won't surprise you if I say both. Definitely both. Yeah, I think hard for me not to imagine that both are essential here. I do think, we have to live in the reality we're in. So I for sure encourage people to develop a set of coping skills that are useful for you, that fit for you. Also, like, seek support. There is something so powerful about knowing that you're not alone, even if that is like anonymous support, right? Even if that's finding a subreddit that you like and where you can feel less alone and feel a sense that you're not the only person with this issue. So whether that's, professional help or meeting other people in real life or people online or anonymous or whatever it might be, I think seeking support from others is something that is really powerful. Like we're not meant to be isolated individuals. Like we're just not that kind of creature, I don't think. So yeah, I think building your own coping skills is something that is worthwhile and valuable, and also the onus should not be on individuals. I think, I'm excited about just advocacy that has been emerging within the hoarding community, and I hope to see a lot more of that. And I also, want those of us who are professionals to be advocating much more vocally against hoarding stigma. We don't know exactly how much like stigma there is among professionals, but I would say I see examples of it and things like that. So I want us as professionals to be advocating for much better education, to be assessing. We don't even have stats right now on like how much knowledge people have about hoarding disorder. My impression is it's pretty limited. A lot of psychology training programs are spending very little time on it. A lot of providers, I think, are not trained in an evidence-based treatment for hoarding. So I would like to see those things change. I think that will be essential. I think within the public sphere, it's important for us to be advocating if there are things like hoarding related media showing up, that we are providing a thoughtful lens and critique of that when necessary. Yeah, one thing that I keep coming back to, which I'm gonna shoehorn in here a little bit, but I think a lot about like evolution, human evolution, like what kind of environments did we evolve in, and how can that explain some of our psychology and behavior? And one thing I've been thinking about more and more, and we'll be clear that like I don't have research on this, I don't think anybody else has research explicitly on this topic, but to me it makes a lot of sense that like there was probably a time where it would have been really valuable to have some people who hold on to a lot of things, some people who can see the value in every item and the potential use for every item. Like that makes a lot of sense to me, that within a group that has a few of those people might survive better than a group that doesn't have any of them. And we see like hoarding behavior in all sorts of different animal species, right? Like we see it over and over in different types of animals. So I think I like to keep in mind that perspective, that like there may well be nothing sort of inherently wrong, and may even be sort of inherently beneficial. Like as we kind of talk about that perspective for other conditions like ADHD, I think that's something that increasingly we should keep in mind as a possibility and investigate as a possibility for hoarding too, that in some contexts it may well be adaptive or have been adaptive. And really, I think where it kind of hits, where it gets tough is the mismatch with like our current society, right? That we have more stuff available than ever before. We have more free things and cheap things and easy to acquire things. And we have to like actively work to not have like, you go to an event and people give you a t-shirt and you're like, okay. But like there is just kind of an influx of stuff in my life. And so I think sometimes the right way to think about this isn't even necessarily like a medical disease model, but a model of a misfit between human adaptation, human evolution, and the context that we're in currently. So that's, again, like not certain from any scientific perspective, but something I'm thinking about.
And I do know for a fact that I'm not the only hoarder who, at the start of COVID, when nobody could buy toilet paper, had a moment of, maybe I was right.
Yeah. For certain contexts, for contexts of scarcity, like there are.
Yeah, I was like, maybe I was right. And then I was like, this is a terrible thing to have happened.
Yeah.
Because I have tinned food and toilet paper, and I wish it hadn't reinforced why that feels good. And you mentioned there seeking community.
Yeah.
With other people who hoard in particular. Are there any other steps people can take if they're feeling really burdened by this stigma to try and shake it off a bit?
That's a good question. I think, yeah, seeking support from others, certainly. I think a lot of those sort of general tools of acceptance and commitment therapy, whether you're, interested in working with a therapist in person or looking at self-help, I do think those things make sense to me as being potentially valuable. I think self-compassion kind of focused things can be really helpful too. We know that self-criticism and shame are such a major part of this experience. So I think, there's kind of like a range of mindfulness exercises and self-help books and things that I think can be valuable and can be a useful first step, and kind of give some ideas about how you might go about holding that stigma or holding sort of negative ideas about yourself more lightly.
I've been doing some de-hoarding accountability Zoom sessions where me and whatever listeners want to come along spend 90 minutes on Zoom. We've nearly always all got our cameras off, but we just we pick a focus and we get on with it while chatting to other people in the same situation. And it's so nice. And something that has stood out to me, there's only been 3 so far. The next one is Friday, which is the day this comes out, is that much as I judge and stigmatize myself all the time, I don't chat with these people and think terrible things about them.
Yeah.
I only think those terrible things about myself. And it's kind of quite an old psychological trick, isn't it? Like, what would you say to a friend in that situation? We would very rarely be as cruel to a friend as we are to ourselves. And that's it can be a bit like trying to talk yourself into feeling something. But it is quite powerful when you realise that if this was your friend or if this was a stranger on Zoom with their camera off, you probably wouldn't be thinking that they are terrible. You'd be thinking, gosh, they've had a hard time, or aren't they doing well to try, or whatever those things are that we don't really apply to ourselves so much.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Sometimes even like when your mind is really being harsh, even just sort of saying an ouch to yourself, ouch, that hurt. I think that can be a way of, like developing that sort of sense of empathy. And I think I would also say kind of really giving yourself credit for the things that you are doing. Yeah, really sort of acknowledging steps you are taking, things you are trying, even if they don't feel like they're 100% to your standards or 100% complete, or maybe not satisfying everybody else around you. Giving yourself credit for the work that you're doing is also really essential in anything as anything as hard as this.
Yeah, absolutely. So if people want to find you online or get in touch, social media, anything like that, where can they do so?
Yes, that would be lovely. I do have, so the main thing to find is my lab website, which is maplab, maplab.squarespace.com. And that's where we list like studies that we're running. We often run some self-help studies, so I'd love for people to check that out. We have a mailing list on the website where people can sign up. We don't send things out terribly often, so it'd be occasional updates from the lab about, new studies and stuff like that, or other kind of news. We have a blog at the website too with any kind of recent things, or I'm sure this will go up at some point as well. We do have like a lab Facebook and Instagram, which are linked on that website as well, that I would love for people to follow and hear about. And people are also welcome to shoot me emails at my university email address.
I will link to everything in the show notes anyway, but feel free to.
Yeah, lovely. So people are welcome to read, who are curious about my work in any way, are welcome to reach out over email. It's jek299@msstate.edu.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jennifer. That's really interesting area, and it feels like it at least can be really core to a lot of people's experience of this problem, and it's so important that people are looking at it.
Yeah, I'm hoping to continue doing lots of work, lots of research in that area, and hopefully destigmatizing hoarding a bit as I go.
I enjoy making this podcast, and it helps me on a personal level. It's a lot of work, but the feedback I get makes it worthwhile. I fund everything about the podcast myself. So if you want to help to ensure the future of the podcast, you can help me to cover the costs by sending a one-off or recurring donation at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/donate. Shout out this week to the Guilty Feminist podcast that I will link to in the show notes at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. Have a listen to Deborah Francis White from the Guilty Feminist podcast. She starts with a quote she's read, and then she and her guests talk about that.
A person's ability to grow is directly related to the amount of truth they can accept about themselves. Oh, is that true and awful? I hate how true that is. I hate how true that is. Because every way in which I have not grown is something I know I'm not looking at. And all the ways in which I have managed to grow, and I have managed to grow in the last, I would say, 5 years more than I've ever grown in my life, is things I will look in the face. And then I can kind of either get past them or go, that's who I am. Yeah. Sometimes it's just going, that's who you are. And you can change it a bit, but it is who you are. And just being at home with that, just going, I'm making peace with that part of me because it's not that important, but I'm never going to be that. But other ways I've grown because I've looked at it and I've addressed it and I've, done psychedelics and then got past it. But I am growing past some of the stuff, but there are still a few pockets that I reckon I'm not looking at, even when I talk to Mother Earth.
There's always going to be pockets, and also we're all having new experiences all the time.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
we're not static. So
of course
you can resolve all your traumas, but good luck not making any new ones. In the meantime,
That's so true.
It does give you armour if you have learned to process things and face things. Definitely, it gives you resilience going forward.
Feels like an uncomfortable truth, doesn't it? Okay, thank you for listening, and I will speak to you next time. Thank you for listening to That Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you on board. You can find all the links I've mentioned and a transcript of the episode online at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. To find out more about how you can support this podcast and the overall project, go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support and do subscribe to the podcast so you make sure you don't miss any future episodes. There may be links in this podcast that earn me money. This doesn't come at any extra cost to you if you make a purchase through those links, and it helps to support the podcast.